The Volume Podcast.
Hi, my name is Larissa Peixoto Gomes, and I'm a political scientist. Right now, I'm an independent researcher working out of Brazil.
So tell me, what's in you that drove you towards the research that you do?
Well, my research is varied, but I usually gravitate towards electoral systems and political institutions, the legislative mostly. And I do it with a gender perspective and a racial perspective. So looking at women representatives and women candidates and Black women, right now I'm very interested in Indigenous candidacies and representatives. I was always a child and a teenager who kind of wanted to go against the grain and felt some sort of injustice that I couldn't quite put my finger on. And the part about electoral systems is that I like puzzles. The electoral system of any country is just a big puzzle. It's a board game. And I just like to see how everything fits. And when you look at it as a board game and you have the players and you have the rules and you have how you have to play, and essentially sometimes you want to do something that is not in the rule book. So if it's not in the rule book, that means you can do it. It's kind of naughty, but you're allowed. So all of that kind of stuff, I just really enjoy looking at that kind of thing. And when you look at it from this marginalized perspective of the woman, of the Black person, of the Indigenous person, then you just see this huge, broad picture that you didn't know was there.
And how was that for you personally? And please tell us a little bit more about the research.
Well, for me specifically, I started university. I first wanted a law degree, which would have been a terrible idea for me. So the following year, I was thinking, well, what did I like about law? And I realized that I liked sociology, but that course doesn't exist. That major doesn't exist. What exists is social sciences. And my first day, and I remember this very clearly, 7:30 on a Monday morning, I get this professor called Antonio Mitri for Politics 1. And this is the man who was the stereotypical university professor. He was in his late 50s, early 60s, so he's retired now, sadly, for people who cannot be his students anymore. He had a beard. He's Bolivian, so he had a slight accent. He wore a jacket because it was August, so it was a little chilly. And he was brilliant. He was just brilliant. And Politics 1 is political philosophy. So he was over there just talking about Plato. And I'm like, this is what I want. This is so cool. And my fate was a little sealed there, right then and there. Monday morning, 7:30 a.m., first class ever. And the next semester, we had another brilliant professor for Politics 2. And he's the only professor, this is a continuation of political philosophy, contemporary political philosophy. And he is the only professor who teaches Mary Wollstonecraft. So it's really interesting to think about. It's really funny just thinking about how my life, my professional life, was very much guided by two white men who sort of led me down this path of studying marginalized communities. Reading Mary Wollstonecraft was just all of those injustices that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Oh my God, this is it. This is what I was looking for. It was her the whole time. It was what she was saying. And she wrote that in 1792, Vindications of the Right of Woman. And it's still so current. And so I was blown away. And after that, gender just became natural. This is what I'm going to study. So I had a scholarship in the philosophy department, and it was mostly because the professor who had the opportunity there was just a badass woman professor, and I just wanted to be like her. So I didn't really care for the subject matter did not matter to me. She mattered. Like, I want to be around you so you can be my role model. And she was, very much so. And my original idea, I had this huge idea that I couldn't really do. Now I look back on it and go, yeah, I was crazy. This was insane. But I wanted to try to catalog and speak to every single woman federal deputy that was still alive that Brazil has ever had. That would have been too massive.
And if you ever had the chance, what would you ask them?
I wanted to know about their history. I wanted to know why they did what they did, which was run for office. Because running for office to this day is very hard in general, especially in Brazil, even more if you're a woman. So Brazil has a very bizarre electoral system. All electoral systems are like fingerprints. Each country has a slightly different one that makes it very unique, not just in the formal rules, but also in how it interacts with the culture of the country. Ours has both. It has very weird, particular rules that you can't find anywhere else, and it interacts with our culture. And I wanted to know, especially from the older ones, the first ones who started it, why? I guess that's what I think now. That's what I wanted to do, because now I'm looking at it with hindsight. I haven't thought about this idea in years. Why would they even bother? Women tend to participate in politics in many other ways. They do participate in politics, but they try to do it with social movements, and they participate in their neighborhood association, or they donate money to charity. They participate in a lot of charities, and in Brazil particularly, you have the Catholic Church, and you have these sort of yard sales that the Catholic Church does, and psychological help and all of that. But actually running for office, it's a lot. And especially when you have to leave your hometown and go to Brasilia. I guess that's what I wanted to know. I wanted to know their motivation and where that desire came from. But I really haven't thought about this in, 10 years. So my master's research, I did a survey with women candidates here in Minas Gerais for the 2010 election. And then for my Ph.D. research, I did a big data study of legislative actions in Brazil, UK, and Sweden to see how women's substantive representation happens. And I went to each of these countries and interviewed people there. Yeah, I tend to gravitate towards what we call a most different approach. So I like to compare different things and see if I find similarities between them rather than compare similar systems. So what I found for my master's research was this idea that women didn't want to travel. So more than 90% of the candidates were local. So that was one thing. The other thing was that they didn't have political experience. They didn't really have political careers. So they hadn't really been city councilors. Some of them had been principals in schools, which is an appointed office here for public schools. And they just were mostly out of their depths, because that's what happens to women in politics. At the beginning, especially, a lot of them think that it's just about running, just putting your name on the ballot, and then you can run for office. which is not true. Then when you reach higher levels and you're interviewing them, an elected woman, and she's already a state deputy or a federal deputy, then her experience is completely different. It's just another world. And then you see that women get clustered. They get, pushed aside to smaller cities where the competition is not as strong and where they won't be able to break out of. And another thing that I noticed was that the women who were elected that year spent the same amount of money that men who were elected did, but they had fewer votes, much fewer votes. And that is something that I am publishing on now.
That's extremely interesting. And what did you find when you were comparing the three nations?
So the comparison there was that the findings, the first finding that I am working on now to get published in peer review is that each country developed their own idea of a hegemonic feminist discourse. So each of them decided what was the best way to present, culturally decided, not, rationally, decided what was the best way to present an idea to get it legislated on. So in Brazil, you can't really use words like gender or feminism. So you say women's rights. That is the key word. If you're saying, oh, this is about women's rights, then you can get away with it. Then it's easier for you to talk about, as long as it's not about reproductive rights. If you're talking about reproductive rights, no amount of, packaging is going to sell that idea. In Sweden, it's the opposite. It's the other way around. You have to talk about gender equality. You can't talk about women's rights because in Sweden, their perspective is of equality and gender equality, and what is good for one has to be good for the other. So it's gender equality. However, because of this, they don't have a domestic violence legislation put in place like we do. Because when you talk about that, you're talking about a man as an aggressor and a woman as a victim. And they haven't found a way to put that in a way that, benefits men as well. They usually have to also use kind of an economic discourse. So say something like, oh, if women are in the workplace, then it benefits the country financially. Even though there are studies proving that domestic violence takes a financial toll in the country, they haven't been able to get that idea across in Sweden. So they have their, criminal law, and they have to use that to help women in situations of domestic violence. In the UK, the discourse that is most often used is liberal feminism. So UK is a very individualist country. And so the discourse that most often resonates is women are entitled as individuals to equal rights under the law. So it's more like she's individually allowed to have this and that right, not as much as a woman, but as a person, of course, but there's no legislation as a group. There's no perspective of this as a shared experience of all women go through a similar process and a similar problem. And in the UK, it's has become really problematic because they have a problem with transphobia that has become extremely apparent lately, but it has been growing, but it's been latent in society there. And it definitely shows that idea of liberal feminism is the woman as an individual being equal before the law, but as that woman who is a cisgender woman. A trans woman doesn't have any rights. So these are ideas that can package often, a feminist legislative action into being approved. So the domestic violence bill here in Brazil, the domestic violence law, Maria da Penha law, was completely packaged in that way as women's rights. Women are suffering, women are victims, women need this to protect them. And now, after this has been going on, it was passed in 2006. Before the Maria da Penha law, there was no discussion of domestic violence in Brazilian legislation. And now it is constant because it created a framework in which domestic violence can be discussed. And it is essentially a consensual issue. So men and women legislators and men in the left, men in the right, Bible caucus, bullet caucus, they don't care. They're like, no, order and progress. Let's castrate rapists, because it seems like they are protecting women. They're the big protectors. So it just became this umbrella issue that everybody can get behind, which is not really that helpful anymore. That is kind of how things work in the political sphere. You just create something that's going to resonate with the voter, and everybody's going to jump on it. So that's one of the conclusions that I found. The other is the importance of critical actors. So while collective action is important, having a women's caucus like Brazil does, that's another paper I'm working on getting out now. Mostly you really need a few key actors who are poised to really go to bat for gender legislation and women's legislation. So these are the people who are not worrying that much about other issues, who are constantly writing about this. They are the ones who know the research, they know what's going on, they know what's happening. They are the ones writing about it, they're the ones speaking about it, they're the ones asking for support from other legislators and negotiating their position. But in order to get that person into a position of power, that takes a while. So they have enough position to negotiate. And what happened with our women's caucus was it got powerful and it immediately became an object of contention. As soon as it became powerful, the then president of the chamber, who was Eduardo Cunha, decided that the way it was formed needed to change. And so one of the most important rules about politics is know the rules. And this was a man who knew the rules. And the rules said the Women's Caucus votes and decides who is going to be the head of the Women's Caucus according to the proportional representation. It was always understood that it was the proportional representation of women within the caucus. Never let anything in politics be understood. Have it in writing. Because what Eduardo Cunha did was, no, it's the proportional representation in the Chamber of Deputies. And the proportional representation in the Chamber of Deputies leaned center-right, not left, like the Women's Caucus. So all of a sudden, this body, this political body that had always been left-wing, became right-wing. And it's fine to a point because they're still working on consensual issues of maternity and pregnancy and humanized labor for women, humanized, pregnancy and delivery of children. But the more important, the other issues, not more important, but more contentious issues that other deputies worked on, they are definitely completely off the table.
And how knowing all this changed your vision of the world?
I am a little bit more jaded. Not gonna lie. Although sometimes I wish I was more jaded because this year has been rough on me, like it has been on everyone. When President Dilma suffered the coup on April 17th, I was in tears. I was in a fetal position, crying, watching the vote. But it takes a moment like that. I knew that was coming. There was no doubt in my mind that that was going to happen. It still took a toll. Or when Bolsonaro was elected, I knew that was happening. I was still drunk and in tears because it takes a toll. Because it also, as much as I am jaded, I can see a bit ahead. So I looked at the celebration of people who support Bolsonaro, and I just saw in my head like a bad movie everything that was coming, everything that we're living. I didn't see a pandemic, but there were people in the United States who did when Trump was elected. They were warning people a pandemic is likely to happen, especially under this administration. And I saw hunger coming back. I saw the dollar rising. It was just playing in my head. I was at a friend's house and we were all drinking because we were all depressed. And I was bawling. It's ridiculous, but I was. And so most of the time I am a bit more jaded. Like what was it that people sent me the other day? They sent me something. People were shocked that whatever was happening. I'm like, how can you be shocked that this is happening? And it was other political scientists who sent me some news story. I'm like, this is pretty clear that it was going to happen. So most of the time, this is just run of the mill. But then you have these big moments, and they do take a toll. Even though I see them coming, I just go, oh no, this is exhausting.
And Larissa, what do you think you will be working on in 10 years' time?
Well, assuming that I do get a job, because the academic market is on fire due to these administrations, due to Bolsonaro, Trump, Boris Johnson, all of these guys are just destroying academia. I think we are going to study this time, all of these decisions, COVID, everything, for a really long time. People were very hopeful and looking at women leaders to see if their leadership has meant that COVID actions were not as impactful. These women, Jacinda Ardern, unfortunately, there are not enough women leaders for us to say that this is true. That it was because they are women that they took the correct action. But hopefully there is something coming. I don't think Trump is going to win. It doesn't seem like he is. But right now, I don't have my hopes up for anything. Anything can happen. Bolsonaro won because of WhatsApp messages. So anything can happen at this point. People sometimes ask me how my city is doing, how Belo Horizonte is doing with the pandemic. And I'm like, we were lucky because the mayor, who is most of the time just is terrified of dying from COVID. He's terrified. And we're lucky that he's that terrified. And that's the bad thing. That's the bad thing about having this position that we are seeing now globally of anti-politics and electing people who have no experience in politics and no interest in politics and are being elected because they say, I am anti-politics, which is the biggest paradox. Because you have no idea how these people are going to act. You don't know what's going to happen because they're unpredictable. They are not there to legislate. They're not there to lead. They're just there because they had a whim. Oh, look, somebody told me I could be mayor because I own this football club. So I am going to run for office. No, you fund a campaign if you feel that strongly, but stay in your house. We don't need you in politics. And I think that is something that we need to look at. I think local government is going to become something that we are going to study more and more, because as we have seen, especially here, but also in other places, local government has become really important in fighting the pandemic and in relating to citizens. I have an indication, so this is completely just my my political scientist brain that has no proof, no evidence. I have not studied this yet, but I just have the idea that people are feeling closer to local government than to national governments. So this might be something, an avenue of increased studies. And the internet. The internet is another field of study. Internet and politics, politicians on Twitter, politicians on Instagram. Look, there's a pretty daisy through concrete. Oh no, you're a terrible politician. That's politics now. They tweet photos and they Instagram things, and they're just there because they're people too. And that's how they're interacting. And I am actually working on a couple of studies with Twitter and politicians as well. And with the podcast that I work on, also, I take a lot of historical views on Brazilian politics. And we just see history repeating itself over and over and over and over again. And there was a few episodes ago, we talked about an event in Brazilian history that was just so close. It was the vaccine revolt. And it was just so close to events that are contemporary. What happened to President Dilma. The only difference is that there was no coup. President Rodrigues managed to stay in office, but it was the same, the spread of fake news. And both me and my co-host were like, how are we not learning? At some point, somebody needs to do a big study on this sort of cyclical nature of politics. I haven't seen, I'm sure there's somebody trying to or has, and we haven't given it enough attention, because we need to learn how to not repeat our mistakes.
And how do you think that people that are listening to the podcast right now will be affected by this?
You know, when all of this began, I remember very clearly, all of this, I mean the pandemic, I invited my nephew to come with me to a rehearsal of a band in a studio. And back then, there were only a few cases in China and Italy. So when his dad went, but have any of the band members been to China recently? I'm like, no, of course not. This thing is not going to spread. It's not going to get here. We have a tendency to think that things don't apply to us and that they're not going to reach us. I'm not immune to that either. So that's why I like to give that example. Like, I didn't think that, 7 months later, I'd be saying it applies to you. I am stuck in my house. And 7 months ago, I was laughing at my nephew's dad because he was afraid I was going to expose my nephew. So things apply to you. You may be in an area that is having raging fires. That's climate change. Climate change can be stopped. You have to vote for the right people for that to happen. You may be in an area that's flooding. That's climate change. Same thing. The pandemic can be stopped. You have to vote. Why? Because the right people in office will fund the right ideas. for a vaccination, for social distancing, for economic policies. So we had a chance to have an economist with a degree in political science who also has a degree in law. That was the guy who's going to be our president. But Bolsonaro won because a third of the population decided to void their votes. It was not because people voted for Bolsonaro. People have a right to vote for anybody they want, and they were tricked by a lot of fake news. But there was a whole third of the Brazilian population who voided their votes. And that means that Bolsonaro did not win 50% of the votes. He did not win half of the population. He won a third. And that means that there are two-thirds suffering because of him. So we have a cabinet that has one woman who is a Christian fundamentalist who is completely bonkers. We have the guy who's in the environment ministry saying, let's use this time to do all the shit we want to do and take all the land we want to take. Indigenous people are being murdered left and right as if it was 500 years ago. This is war for them. It has always been war for them. So it affects you. Everything that's happening now is because somebody voted. And I know we want to avoid the hard conversations. I know it's hard to talk to your 75-year-old aunt and tell her, please, please, pretty please, vote for this person and not that person. But we have to. We just have to. We can't afford not to, because otherwise we're going to die. We're all going to die. And if we do survive, I do want to listen to all the shitty, peppy music that's going to happen for the next 10 years, because that's what happens after, disgrace falls on us. You listen to the music from the 20s and the music from the 50s, and it's all really peppy. And I want to listen to that. So let's survive this. Vote, and vote correctly. And you know what I mean.
The Volume Podcast.